Conflicts that shaped Pharaonic Egypt, Lecture 11. The Catastrophe, Ramessid Egypt and the End of the Bronze Age.
The city of Kadesh changed hands several times during the New Kingdom, becoming an Egyptian dependency during the reign of Thutmose III, and passing into the Hittite sphere of influence during a Hittite campaign in the reign of Akhenaten. Akhenaten attacked Kadesh unsuccessfully, and Tutankhamun followed with his own attack. Tutankhamun appears at least to have brought back some captured enemy ruler, possibly the ruler of Kadesh, but certainly the Egyptians did not stay in the area. Both Egyptian campaigns against Kadesh elicited fairly restrained Hittite counterattacks into Egyptian territory, both Hittite attacks into Amki in northern Palestine. Why were both Egypt and the Hittites apparently content with Amurru, but worried about taking and holding Kadesh? A corridor east of Amurru, passing near Kadesh, could indeed allow a northern enemy to threaten Egyptian control in Syria-Palestine, and might equally allow a northern military force to bypass Egypt's garrisons and dependencies on the Mediterranean coast. If a Hittite force slipped past Amurru on its way south, it might equally avoid Moab, the region of Transjordan east of the Dead Sea. The Kadesh corridor did not simply bypass Amurru, but provided access to the Wadi Sirhan east of Moab in modern Jordan, through which an army advancing south could bypass all major centers to the west. During the early Islamic period, the Wadi Sirhan provided a direct route between Damascus, itself not far from Kadesh, and Arabia, and the early Umayyad rulers endowed the region of Moab and the Wadi Sirhan with a series of hunting lodges and postal stations because of this ease of travel between the region of Damascus and Arabia. In fact, the history of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem during its attacks on Egypt in the mid-12th century and in its attempts to support the fiefdom of Transjordan during the same century make clear the sort of threat that a northern enemy might pose to Egypt if it could skirt the old region of Amurru. 5 times during the 1160s, King Amalric of Jerusalem invaded Fatimid Egypt. The second, third, and fourth of these invasions by the Kingdom of Jerusalem via Ashkelon along the coast were countered by the army of Aleppo advancing from Damascus, again not far from Old Kadesh, and traveling into the fiefdom of Transjordan, the old region of Moab, before crossing Sinai and reaching the eastern Nile Delta. Even with old Moab garrisoned, the Kingdom of Jerusalem found it difficult to block the southern movement of Syrian forces. If the Hittites had managed to bypass Amurru via the Kadesh-Wadi Sirhan corridor, they might also have been able to march directly on the border of the Nile Delta itself. Raids and counter-raids by the Egyptians and the Hittites in the regions of Amki and Uppa, not far from Kadesh, reveal that both sides understood the problem of Amurru's eastern hinterland, where both the Egyptians and the Hittites would struggle, but neither appears really to have attempted to press an advantage. Kadesh, however, which was the fulcrum in this seesawing struggle, was ultimately too important to resist. After the seeming quiet during the reign of Horemheb at the end of the 18th dynasty, and following the short reign of the aged Ramses I at the beginning of the 19th dynasty, Seti I adopted a very aggressive foreign policy in the northeast. Sometime after his second regnal year, Seti advanced up the Levantine coast, went through Amurru, and then attacked Kadesh, nominally allied with the Hittites. Seti successfully captured the city, and at that time, or perhaps shortly thereafter, Seti defeated an actual Hittite military force. In his battle scenes on the exterior north wall of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak Temple, Seti I shows himself with an Egyptian force fighting actual Hittites in battle. This appears to be the first time we can say for certain that an Egyptian force met not the surrogates of the Hittites, but an actual main Hittite battle force. Seti's campaign did not really ultimately alter the extent of Egyptian influence in Syria-Palestine. At the end of the campaign, Seti I and the Egyptian forces withdrew, and Kadesh returned to Hittite control. In fact, comically enough, Seti I set up a stela at Kadesh. Upon the departure of the Egyptians, the citizens of Kadesh took the stela down, but they appear to have stored it carefully and undamaged in a room, just in case the Egyptians came back and they needed to put it up quickly. Seti I's lack of concern with this apparent rapid reversion of Kadesh to the Hittite fold suggests that his goal was not the occupation of territory, but perhaps he intended to force a treaty with the Hittites. We know already of an earlier treaty, the so-called Treaty of Karush Tama. Both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun before Seti, in their attacks on Kadesh, may in fact themselves not have been attempting a long-term occupation of Kadesh, but perhaps leverage in order to achieve some sort of legal agreement with the Hittites, probably with a view towards sealing off this Kadesh corridor that was always open, always a worry in the back of the pharaonic mind. The ultimate resolution to the Egyptian-Hittite conflict and the Kadesh corridor would not come until the 21st regnal year of Ramses II, the son of Seti I. 16 years after the great battle he would fight against the Hittites under Muwatallis at Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh between Ramses II and Muwatallis is often credited as a Hittite victory. In fact, what one can say is that the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II was essentially a strategic victory for the Hittites and a tactical victory for the Egyptians. Ramses II advanced north with 4 major armies. For some reason, he allowed them to become quite widely strung out along a north-south line of march. He raced north towards Kadesh with the army of Amun, leaving a second army at that point crossing the Orontes River, and 2 other armies still to the south. The Egyptians captured 2 local Bedouin, who assured them, and being apparently Hittite spies, one might expect this, who assured the Egyptians that the Hittites were very far away. Ramses then advances even farther ahead of the army of Amun with his own bodyguard and certain elements of the army and sets up camp very close to Kadesh. At this point, Ramses' men capture 2 actual Hittite soldiers. With a little bit of persuasion in the form of a beating, the Hittites inform Ramses that, yes indeed, a massive Hittite army is at this side, just on the other side of the hill atop which sits the city of Kadesh. Ramses unfortunately did not have any time to react to this news, because at that moment Hittite chariots began attacking his own camp. Ramses had only seconds to react, and in his reaction he shows his tactical brilliance on the battlefield. Rather than simply trying to get away, Ramses and a small force of personal bodyguard with his charioteer Menna and his span of horses named Mut is Pleased and Victory in Thebes, charged into elements of the Hittite chariotry not yet engaged in the battle. This was apparently the last thing those Hittite chariots expected to see, the glint of the gold of the chariot of Pharaoh himself firing at them. Apparently, according to the texts, they were so nervous their arrows could not strike the king. Time and again, Ramses and his chariots drive in through the Hittite force, pouring arrows on them, drive back out, and then launch yet another attack. The Hittites are not prepared for this. Most of those men are probably entirely terrified that the actual son of Re himself is bearing down on them with elements of the army of Ammon. At the same time, Hittites who are plundering the Egyptian camp that Ramses has wisely abandoned in order to launch his counterattack, those Hittites suddenly find a fifth Egyptian force, an army of which they probably were not aware, attacking them, having apparently marched along a coastal route towards Kadesh. Hittite forces had attacked the second Egyptian army, the one that was crossing the Orontes. That army rather ignominiously ran from the battlefield, to Ramses' great anger. However, the Hittite forces that Ramses attacks have apparently decided at this point that they aren't ready to go into battle yet. They began a retreat. They try to cross the Orontes to get back to the other side, at the same time that other Hittite chariots are still pouring across the Orontes. The resulting bottleneck at the ford becomes a catastrophe as the retreating forces and the advancing forces will not stop either for the other. The Egyptian depictions of the battle show numerous important Hittites being raised up out of the water and having the water shaken from them. Many of the Hittites apparently drown in this bungled crossing and retreat of the Orontes. At the same time, the Egyptians have seen a fifth army come on the field. The second army is not destroyed, but has simply been put to flight and has now, much chagrined, reformed itself and is returning to the battle, and two fresh Egyptian armies still have not arrived at Kadesh. The Hittites never committed their infantry, only their chariotry. As a result of this, a truce is declared, essentially. Ramses has completely destroyed the tactical battle plan of the Hittites. Nevertheless, they still remain in control of Kadesh. The confident attackers became the prey of the son of Re himself at the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II, and Ramses held out long enough for his armies finally to come to the rescue. Ramses had made a grave strategic error, but the logistics of the Egyptian plans, particularly the arrival of this additional force called the Narin, and the genius of Ramses' retreat as counterattack tactics, combined with the poor tactics of the Hittite army, the failure to send in any infantry to support their chariot attack, contributes to the final tactical victory of the Egyptian army. After Ramses withdrew from Kadesh, the Hittites appear finally to have attempted to outflank Egypt in a grand way by gaining the allegiance of rulers of Moab. With Moab allied to the king of the Hittites, Hittite forces might indeed have been able to march directly to the border of the Nile Delta. Hittites and their allies in Moab might have been able to lure the Egyptian forces and allied coastal forces across the Jordan. The history of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem provides support for such a scenario once again. Saladin, launching attacks on Transjordan in response to provocation by Renaud de Chatillon, was able to draw the forces of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem away from their western bases, west of the Jordan. Once those forces left their familiar homelands, Saladin's nephew, based at Damascus, attacked the undefended Galilee. In order to prevent any such scenarios, in order to prevent the Hittites from marching directly on the Delta, in order to prevent the Hittites and the Moabites from luring coastal allies away from their homelands, probably during the summer bridging his 7th and 8th regnal years, Ramses II attacked Moab, accusing its rulers of allying themselves to the Hittites. We actually have the text of what Ramses II said to the Moabite rulers recorded in an inscription at Luxor Temple. Ramses sends a message to them. He refuses to speak directly to the rulers. He speaks to a prince who then turns around and speaks to those rulers himself. And Ramses says, "You are bad, and no one knows any good thing about you. So it is said in the palace, for you have allied yourself with that Hittite, another bad man exactly like yourselves." By attacking Moab, Ramses prevented any Hittite force from being able to advance south into his sphere of influence via the Kadesh corridor. He prevented a turning of the Egyptian right flank while he himself advanced north again. By regnal year 8, Ramses II is back with a vengeance in the Galilee. By year 9, he has captured Dapur north of Amuru, outflanking Kadesh altogether. In year 10, he's back in coastal Syria-Palestine, attacking pro-Hittite Dapur again. Eventually, the Egyptians under Ramses II capture Kode in the land of Naharine, back in the old territory of Mitanni, revealing what appears to be a complete collapse of Hittite military resistance in the south. Events in the reign of Ramses II reveal that the Hittites and the Egyptians were aware of the corridor leading south past Kadesh, and that both were willing and ultimately able to exploit that route. Both Egypt and the Hittites understood the importance of Moab and Transjordan as bases giving access ultimately to the Sinai and Egypt. Fortunately, Ramses II appears to have understood all of this a bit better than did the Hittites. The end, ultimately, of the Egyptian-Hittite conflicts that stretch back to the time of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten is a peace treaty, the first recorded major treaty between major powers, between the Hittites and the Egyptians, signed during the reign of Ramses II. After the death of several heirs, Ramses II's 13th son, Merneptah, already almost 60 years old at the time, succeeded his father on the throne. In the 5th year of Merneptah's reign, a large coalition of Libyan tribes to the west, along with associated Mediterranean pirates, people we call the Sea Peoples, attempted to invade the Nile Delta. Although Ramses II constructed a series of forts along the Mediterranean coast, this Libyan Sea People coalition used the oases of the Western Desert to avoid Egyptian defenses and gain access to the Nile Valley. The desert routes may also have allowed the Libyans to encourage Nubian tribes to revolt against Egyptian forces in the south. This does indeed occur during the reign of Merneptah, further fragmenting Egyptian military resources. Ultimately, Merneptah properly guesses the path of the final Libyan Sea People's attack, and after a 6-hour battle not far from Memphis, the Egyptian army defeated the invaders. The Libyan Sea People coalition was so very dangerous because it presented the attack of massed infantry armed with a new type of sword, fighting against an older, elite military force of the ancient Near East. This was a harbinger of doom to come for all of the older powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, with the exception of Egypt. We can already see, if we look at the Battle of Kadesh between Ramses II and the Hittites, that something has changed in the way the Hittites are fighting between the reign of Seti I and Ramses II. The ancient Egyptians, like most of the major and even smaller powers of the ancient Near East, adopted the horse and chariot as one of the elite elements of their fighting forces. Horses and chariots require a lot of funding and much upkeep. Specialists have to build the chariots, have to prepare the horses and train them. The breeding and the upkeep of the equids is quite expensive. The great chariot armies of the ancient Near East, Egypt included, used chariots apparently as rapid archers' platforms. An archer and driver rode in each chariot. The chariots would apparently charge against enemy chariotry, against enemy infantry, and at the last moment wheel about so that the archers could rake the front of the enemy with their arrows. These are not shock vehicles. The comparison sometimes made between chariots and tanks is ridiculous. You cannot charge a fortification with a chariot. You cannot easily charge in amongst enemy infantry with a chariot, unless, of course, you want to find your horses dead and yourself facing a lot of rather angry infantry pulling you out of the chariot cab. The chariot is a mobile platform for archers, so that you can rake the front of an advancing enemy force, so that you can send archers rapidly to particular points of the battle where you need them. Reliance on chariot forces by these various armies appears to have led to an almost sort of ritualized form of warfare, a very rapid, almost naval style of warfare in which these great moving masses of chariotry on the two sides would fire into each other and rake the enemy advancing infantry with their fire. The expense of maintaining a chariot army meant that smaller kingdoms, city-states, etc., could not possibly hope really to oppose successfully the army of a major power. It encouraged allegiances and alliances. Just at the Battle of Megiddo, Egypt faced a massive alliance of local groups egged on by Mitanni. Reliance on chariot warfare also meant that major developed societies could take advantage of their more developed economies. These wealthier groups could afford to field these elite armies of professional soldiers and expensive chariotry. They could afford to do this with greater elements of their society free to increase their own economies and allow them to support even more of these expensive elite military units. The horror of a massed infantry attack by less developed groups for the old kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean was that it was rather difficult ultimately for chariot forces to oppose those people if they were well armed. Chariot warfare relied on projectiles, most commonly bow and arrow, sometimes javelins, etc. When we look at the Hittite forces fought by Seti I in his campaign at Kadesh, we see that the Hittites are using the chariots, as are the Egyptians, as mobile archers' platforms. However, if we look at the scenes of the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II, something has changed. Suddenly we can understand how Ramses was relatively easily able to mount multiple charges against opposing Hittite chariotry and ultimately send those chariots fleeing. The Egyptian chariots at Kadesh and Ramses II had come to fight a traditional chariot war with archers using the chariots as mobile archers' platforms. The Hittites, however, have shown up at Kadesh with a slightly different type of chariot force. Whereas the Egyptian chariots have the wheels mounted far back at the very end of the cab, so that it can be a very lightweight vehicle that can turn on a dime and turn at relatively high speed without simply flipping over, the Hittite chariots at Kadesh appear to be clunkier, heavier vehicles with a center-mounted axle. They're heavy now because they're carrying 3 people. There's a driver, there's a shield bearer, apparently, and there is a fighter in the chariot. But now, not apparently an archer, but a man armed with a spear. Now, some people have suggested that maybe the Hittites were using the chariots for an elaborate form of chariot-based jousting. It makes one cringe to think what would happen if 2 chariots tried to joust with each other. Apparently, what the Hittites have done is convert their chariot forces from the use of chariotry as mobile archers' platforms to the use of chariots as battle taxis. These are now chariots carrying mounted infantrymen. These are chariots used to mass infantry at a particular area of a battle, to move infantry about. The Hittites are now prepared to fight from chariots the way Homeric heroes fight. They ride up to a point in the battle and get out of the chariot. Interestingly enough, we know at the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II, the Hittites have marshaled forces from far away. Some of the more barbarian dependencies of the Hittites, charioteers with shaved heads and long pigtails hanging from their heads, are driving some of their chariots, and we know that the Hittites have been having trouble with a group of barbarians on their far western border, whom they, in their texts, call the Achiyawa, and whom we would call the Achaeans. Certain of the Proto-Greek groups have been causing trouble for the Hittites. Apparently, in fighting those barbarians, those Hittite versions of the Egyptians' sea peoples, the Hittites have gone from using chariots for archers to using chariots as battle taxis. The reason this became necessary, and the reason ultimately the Libyans caused such a problem for the Egyptians, is because into the Eastern Mediterranean, in the years before 1200 BCE, come new technologies. At home, ultimately in the Carpathian region of southeastern Europe, the lands of a group of people we refer to generally as the Urnfield culture, we begin to see the use of body armor, heavy metal plate body armor, large, round, what we would call hoplite-style shields, and a superior type of sword that we call the Nawa II type sword. Nawa, after a German scholar who created a typology of ancient swords. Prior to the influx into the Eastern Mediterranean of the Nawa II type sword during the Ramessid period, swords that we see in the ancient Near East are not very powerful. They are better called rapiers, long, narrow blades with little tangs that stuck into a separately made handle. The genius of the Nawa II sword is that a metal handle is poured with the blade itself. 2 pieces of perhaps ivory or wood could then be attached to this handle to help absorb the shock from the blade. This new Nawa II type sword means that if you strike something metal, or if you strike another sword, something thick, the force of the blow passes into a handle that is forged with the sword itself. If you were to use one of those old rapiers to parry a blow, the blade would simply bend at its weakest point, which was the tang where it attached to the handle. The old rapiers were for sticking down at someone, probably from the height of a chariot or such. The Nawa II sword is to be wielded in the hands of a heavy-armed proto-hoplite infantryman and used in a slashing manner. Already in the 18th dynasty, we see certain of these sea people, whom the Egyptians called the Sherdan, coming into Egyptian service, bringing their heavy armor and their Nawa II-type swords with them. The Egyptians even come to use the term Sherdan to refer to heavy infantry. They rely almost exclusively on these mercenaries for this type of heavy infantry. One of the functions of these mercenary groups is to serve as runners alongside the Egyptian chariots. Heavy infantrymen who are protected by their own armor, who can protect the horses of the chariots next to which they run. The horses being, of course, really even more so than the occupants of the chariots, the most vulnerable elements of a chariot group. These barbarians in Egyptian and Hittite service, called Sherdan or Teharu, essentially pirates, mercenaries who've hired themselves out or been captured by the Egyptians and the Hittites and put into service. These people apparently go home and teach those from whom they come what they know about how these elite forces fight. And one of the things they must have realized is that massed barbarian infantry could in fact defeat these elite chariot armies, at least neutralize the effectiveness with their shield walls and heavy armor, could at least neutralize the effectiveness of the elite elements of the ancient Near Eastern armies, trying to turn it into an infantry versus infantry battle. Merneptah is successful against the invading Libyans and their Sea People's allies, but it took a long time and it took massed, land-based archers to do it. We see in images of Libyan attacks from slightly later, and we know from Merneptah's inscriptions that these Libyans were being outfitted with the new Nawa II-type sword by their Sea People's allies. Although, following Merneptah's defeat of the Libyan Sea People coalition, Egypt was safe from foreign invaders, the domestic situation became problematic after his death. While Merneptah's son Seti II ruled in the north, a usurper took control of Upper Egypt, and shortly thereafter a civil war broke out between different factions, one of which was led by Queen Tawasret, who herself ruled as pharaoh for 2 years. After this tumultuous period, the short-lived pharaoh Setnacht reunified the country and founded the new 20th dynasty. The remainder of the 20th dynasty consists of 9 kings, each of whom took the name Ramses. Most of the pharaohs of this dynasty had short reigns and were actually related in some way or another to King Ramses III, who tried, like his successors, to emulate their great namesake Ramses II. During the 11 years of his reign, Ramses III had to contend with 3 separate invasions, 2 from Libyan tribes with their Nawa II swords, and another a combined land and sea assault by the forces of the Sea Peoples. This invasion of the Sea Peoples appears to have spelled doom for the Hittite Empire and for most of the old states and dependencies in the Eastern Mediterranean. Only Egypt appears to emerge relatively unscathed. Unfortunately for Ramses III, these military battles were not the only conflicts he needed to win. Economic and administrative problems caused a disruption in the food supply for the royal workmen at Deir el-Medina, a settlement in western Thebes that housed the artisans who carved and decorated the royal tombs. Fed up with delayed payments, the workmen went on strike, actually sitting in, the Egyptians actually used the term to sit, hemsi, sitting in at a local temple and refusing to go back to work. Rather than retaliating, Ramses III sent his vizier to negotiate and deliver the payments. After 30 years of rule, Ramses III may have been assassinated as a result of a conspiracy between one of his queens and members of the court. The trial of the perpetrators, recorded in a series of juridical papyri that have survived, indicates that the queen was trying to place her own son on the throne. While the prince was given the lightest of the major punishments, being allowed to commit suicide, several other conspirators were executed.
This ends Lecture 11.